All right, so today we're going to start with a practical session on quantifying cyber losses like an insurer and CFO would. And this is going to highlight the FAIR materiality assessment module, or FAIR-MAM. And it'll focus on how practitioners can focus on the financial side, the magnitude side of the FAIR model. Remember, there's a QR code, so if you have questions, they'll get funneled into Jack's little iPad here, and he can field questions as we go along. So today we have for our panelists, well, I just mentioned Jack, and by the way, I just thought it was a foregone conclusion that he would have the Lifetime Achievement Award for the FAIR Institute. I mean, I just assumed he had it from like day one, okay? So, like, what took you so long? Like, what is it that you did after there? I don't know, okay. And by the way, what do you do after you get a Lifetime Achievement Award? Do you like?
You get to quit.
Yeah, that's what I thought
That's what my assumption is.
I actually had the privilege of winning the Lifetime Achievement Award from SANS. And after that, I was like, what I do? So I switched from security to AI. That was my switch. Anyway, okay. So yeah, so Jack, next year, he's going to retire. Next, we have Monica. And I'll let you guys introduce yourself. Monica from BMS Group. Rob from a Fortune 1000 company, i.e. Caterpillar. That probably means that he didn't get official approval to speak. Anyway. And then lastly, Erica from Safe Security. So I'm going to turn it over to Jack to let it go from here.
All right, super. Can I have the mic?
Oh.
There you go. I have something useful to say. All right, so as a CISO, my weakness when it came to analytics was on this side of the equation, right? The loss magnitude side. I was much more comfortable talking about the probability side, even as difficult as that is. You know, it was less foreign to me than the loss magnitude side. And I think it's probably fair to say, no pun intended, that's true for a lot of CISOs and security professionals is we aren't used to dealing with the loss magnitude side of the equation. And frankly, we shouldn't be expected to be expert in that side because there's a lot of very specific, domain-specific expertise required to get those numbers right. And so that's really what we're here to talk about is how do we make that side of the equation more accessible, more reliable, and that sort of thing. So, and we have some wonderful people up here who have the expertise around this sort of thing to really help guide us in that regard. So, Monica, welcome. Thank you for being here. Can you give us just a very brief sort of description of BMS and your role there?
Yes, thank you for having me. My name is Monica Tigleanu, in case anybody was trying to guess the pronunciation of my last name. I've been with BMS for about 1.5 years, but prior to that, I started in the cyber insurance industry about 13 years ago. Went from underwriting to broking to underwriting to broking, and a lot of my curiosity was around how do underwriters make decisions, how do brokers communicate what information clients need to give those underwriters, and it requires you to kind of jump ship and come back and forth to try to change what information and how underwriters look at that information in an effective manner. BMS is a UK-based global broker. We do both reinsurance and insurance. So in my current role, I actually talk to insurance companies about how they can change the way they underwrite, price, look at claims, because everybody's trying to insure cyber risk in its fullness. There's a lot of areas that are uninsurable still, but it's a pleasure to be here and share some of my experiences and knowledge.
Thank you. Rob, a little bit about your role and your background?
Sure. I'll try to save the puns. You had FAIR and insure, so I don't have any in my back pocket. A little background on me. I started in IT infrastructure, had about 15 years of it prior to getting introduced to FAIR, working for investment bank, financial institutions. And when I got exposed to FAIR, I didn't even know what FAIR stood for, didn't know what risk was. jumped in with a lot of training, and over the last 7-8 years have been building a couple of FAIR programs. So my current role is really architecting the approach to risk quantification, and even outside of risk quantification, but trying to be an advisor to risk wherever we can in the company. Because I don't know if everyone has this experience, but you'll hear a lot of people talk about risk, and sometimes the approach that someone's taking seems like it's a risk-based approach, but it might have partial approach to risk, but not more of a comprehensive, even at a high level, risk equals frequency times magnitude approach. So learning the FAIR model was a huge benefit in just taking a standardized approach to conversations about risk and driving the approaches for our own team, but then also advising on others. So.
Thank you. And Erica, a little bit about your background, and by the way, Erica is the creator of the FAIR-MAM model. So if there's nobody else that knows it better, obviously. So a little bit about you and your background.
Thanks, Jack. My name's Erica Eager. I joined SAFE about 2.5 years ago with the express task of building a financial loss model. My background is I used to be a securities analyst, we translate financial analyst, on Wall Street following large oil companies, building bottoms-up models with very little information because it was illegal to have insider information, and doing quarterly earnings estimates, asset valuations, which were transparent in a sense in that everybody knew how right or wrong you were 4 times a year. Hard on your sleeve. And then I have been in cyber for over a decade, love threat intelligence, love figuring out where the attacker went, what he did, what was the consequences of it. And when COVID lockdown started, I spent 2 years building a database, contextualized database of primary attack costs collected from the original source, and translating that into what industry, what geography, what happened, et cetera. And then when I came to SAFE, brought the database with me. It's now part of SAFE. And we built FAIR-MAM, which was meant to be modular, flexible, fully transparent, fully tunable, and of use to CFOs and to insurance companies so that they could maximally quantify risk.
Thank you. Okay, so let's get into some of the questions. I'll start with you, Rob. You had a background in FAIR before being introduced to FAIR-MAM. So in your experience with FAIR-MAM to date, what have been some of the surprises, the insights, and whatnot that you're seeing?
Interesting. To keep, I know this is supposed to be like a practitioner type of thing, so most of when I speak about this, I try to give insight into how to apply things. The first thing I found that was difficult was I have 6 years of knowledge around the 6 forms of loss that are around the FAIR model, which everybody's probably familiar with here, and you're thinking in those losses, and you think that's the way we approach it, and it's kind of ingrained in you. Now learning something new, to some degree, initially I felt I had to forget what I already knew to then move on to FAIR-MAM, and working with Erica has been amazing because she's been explaining the model to me more and more, but it's structured differently, and it's more fine-tuned or focused and elaborate. So I really had to step out of what my comfort zone was on the right-hand side of the model, which, similar to Jack, the right-hand side of the model is not my forte. I don't know if everyone in here is more technical and cyber related, so you kind of lean toward the left-hand side of the model and controls. So diving into the right-hand side of the model and trying to be open-minded about it and understand it in the granularity that FAIR-MAM provides was a challenge. Then I had to sort of change my thinking a bit and say, all right, I know what these 6 forms of loss are. How do they relate to the FAIR-MAM? What do I know? And maybe I have to change some verbiage, almost do a little translation in my mind. That was probably the biggest hurdle for me.
Okay. So, Monica, how do you see something like FAIR-MAM being of importance in the insurance world, and how can it sort of help not only the insurance organizations but their customers?
So 25 years ago, when the cyber insurance market really came to be, we spent a lot of time on the right-hand side of the model, not knowing a lot about the left-hand side. And we made assumptions that we carry through to today around how we quantify risk to get a premium. So I have some great experiences from an underwriting perspective, so I think it's only fair to share those with you. The insurance company receives questionnaires that you may have seen, or hopefully you have not, so you don't get frustrated with them. But that information then needs to be taken in by an underwriter that not only has to understand what the security controls do for that organization, but needs to understand the business operations, what potential critical assets or dependencies are within that organization. You need to look at the financial statements of that company. You then need to ask who's in charge and how do they govern, and all of that information goes into pricing the risk. Well, until FAIR-MAM was presented, the process wasn't as clear. So when I look at how the methodology to quantify a magnitude of a loss looks like in FAIR-MAM, it's then very easy to train a cyber underwriter what to ask an organization. So have you thought about how much it's going to cost you from an incident response perspective, the types of incident response that you might need for the business that you operate and the systems and the tools that you procure? Do you know how much downtime is realistic as opposed to what is catastrophic? And when underwriters have these conversations, they have them with brokers then have these conversations with treasurers and CFOs, and I guess the CFOs and the treasurers would go to the practitioners to ask some of these questions as well, to understand the dependencies on the processes and the systems. So we all need to kind of share the financial and economic loss language. Otherwise, it's also not fair on the underwriters to understand all the security controls and why they matter, because there is that aspect of it. Some underwriters may be asking you to put security controls in place that they don't really understand the impact that they have.
Erica, so as you've worked with various people like Rob and others on FAIR-MAM, what are some of the things that can make it easier to adopt and apply FAIR-MAM versus some of the things to maybe avoid from a mental block perspective or a process perspective and such?
I think the most important thing is that it requires a shift in thinking, a shift from the survey type mentality, going to say a manager and saying, well, how much do you think downtime will be for your division, or approximately how many records do you think you have, or something like that. The numbers, the operational numbers, the financial numbers need to align with the CFO's office, because the results are ultimately going to the board. And just as on the security side, on the control side, you don't say, well, do you think you have an MFA? How effective do you think it might be? You know, to use the SAFE instance as an example, in our platform, we collect the actual signals from the security controls. We have a whole maturity questionnaire portion for those controls that don't necessarily have signals. We need the same thing on the loss side. We need to actually align with how many records do you actually have. Now, you may be off by 100,000 or something if you have millions of records, but if a company doesn't know that number already, they probably should, because if they get hacked, they're going to need to find it out quickly. So it's part of your business continuity and disaster recovery plan. When it comes to what type of company you have, it really matters how much of your revenue is what we call delayed, where you may not have the ability to collect it, but as soon as the systems come back up, people owe you that money, as opposed to I'm an e-commerce store and I really lost sales. It's very important to understand the value of your IP, because ultimately the board of directors is protecting the owners of the company, the shareholders, the private owners. And the value of the company is to put it in financial terms, all the money the company is going to earn net back to the present. How profitable will this company be in its immediate lifetime? And anything that can really hurt you by interrupting the cash you get, making you lose market share, losing your reputation, all of this can have significant long-term consequences. So there needs to be a shift to aligning to the actual operational profile and financial status of the company.
Thank you.
Can I give an example of how not doing that manifests itself in the insurance world? So 2019 to 2022 was a really rough time for companies purchasing cyber insurance because there was a change in underwriting and a change in pricing. Most often you would hear that cyber insurance companies were doubling, tripling premiums. It was very hard to procure cyber insurance. And that was because the information that was being shared with the insurers did not actually coincide with the claims and the losses that the insurance companies were seeing. So for a ransomware event that most companies thought it was going to be not hitting the 7 figures, the delayed revenue, the downtime, everything that came with the ransomware event was exponential in terms of costs for the insurance company. But that was because insurance companies are making assumptions on your operational profile, on those immediate costs that you have, because you would know your vendors, you would know what sort of business continuity expenses you would have. So to stabilize the insurance markets, the information that you put in has to be more accurate to what the reality is.
And we're all about accuracy with risk measurement, right? That's why we're here. So, Rob, what are some of the challenges you're experiencing or that you envision when it comes to working with stakeholders and getting the information that's required for FAIR-MAM?
FAIR-MAM. I think that the challenge is time, a lot of times, like getting in front of people and getting that information quickly. Again, I'm taking a practitioner view. That's what we're all here for. It's try to understand how to operationalize things and move them a little faster. So the approach I like to take wherever possible is looking for patterns in the, I'll call them application attributes. If an application we know has X type of data, maybe it's PCI records, or you mentioned intellectual property, being able to have that information associated with applications so that it's readily available, that takes time, but for argument's sake, you had that on a silver platter and it was handed to you. You then can start to associate dollar ranges, right? However accurate or wide, or wide or narrow, to those attributes. So then that'll speed things up. But the challenge can be getting that information. If it's not already in place, going to the powers that be and saying, listen, we have applications out there, whatever our repository is, we need to add fields for the business to start to think about. They may not have thought about it before, putting information or documentation around that information so that when they answer questions, they know how to answer it. And one of the hardest things is getting dollar amounts or loss amounts, and they could be either wildly inaccurate, and it's one thing, or rather, Jack, imprecise, I guess that would be more accuracy versus precision, or not applying to the effect. If you have a scenario where you have an availability scenario, and are you going to have productivity loss? Probably. Are you going to have the same loss in a confidentiality scenario? Probably not. It doesn't always fall in that category, but people don't know how to answer those things. So structuring it in a way that they're really thinking about their application, the attributes around their application, and then we become in the back end the translator of those attributes and that to the FAIR-MAM model, or just FAIR in general. That's the challenge, is like setting up that structure, thinking of it from beginning with the end in mind, like coming and say, I'm trying to get here with the information I need. How do I back into that and provide the application owners or the scenarios, people who own those scenarios, with fields that they can provide information so I can get it quickly. That's probably the biggest challenge I see for most people, especially if you're starting out. I'm sure some of us are just beginning, some of us in the middle, more advanced, et cetera.
Monica, what are some of the challenges the insurance industry faces in terms of adopting something like this and and also from a data perspective, because they have claims data historically, but it won't have been structured in this, or put together in this manner. So what are some of the challenges they face?
A challenge is an opportunity in itself. So the presence of FAIR-MAM for the insurance industry is a huge opportunity because it gives the claims information the real flavor that it needs to have. Most insurance companies are still on legacy systems unless you have kind of a new generation InsurTech, if I'm allowed to bring in some insurance terminology. And through the collection of that loss magnitude claims information, it's not as detailed as FAIR-MAM is. And that's where we would like to go to, so that there is a more precise way in which you can adjust premiums, you can provide coverages. A lot of the things that are uninsurable at the moment could potentially become insurable if you can communicate from the client side all the way to the insurance company what the loss magnitude could be, so that they can build reserves, buy reinsurance. There's a whole other risk management process that insurance company needs to think about. So the challenges are awareness at the moment. So even talking within your organizations to your risk managers, your treasurers about FAIR-MAM, and them being able to translate back to the insurance companies in the same methodology, that would be a huge win, because everybody's looking at the same information. If somebody's giving you a price based on information that you don't hold true or valuable, then it's forever going to be a futile discussion and negotiation. On the claims side, I know that there's a lot of organizations that want the claims information from the insurance companies. And yes, there's probably a lot out there in an unstructured manner, but it's not going to be as valuable unless we can come up with an agreement on how to record that claims information. And FAIR-MAM gives us that option. I'll pause there for any comments.
Yeah, no, thank you. So, Erica, what are some of the sources of data that exist that organizations can lean upon as a starting point, or do they exist that organizations can reference, and even within the organizations themselves, where can they go? Who can they turn to get information?
If you are a public company, it becomes much easier. Often I will pre-fill, and we at SAFE, we have what we call a financial impact questionnaire. FAIR-MAM we've built as an engine. It's preceded with a lot of benchmark values for the loss drivers at the bottom. But there's certain information can only come from the company because it's unique to the company's business resource profile, the magnitude of those resources, and revenues and types of business, et cetera. So if you're a public company, the first thing you do is go to the 10K. And you can find a lot of basic information in the 10K. A lot of it, you won't tend to find the number of personal record holder, sensitive personal record holder information that you have, because you don't want the hackers to know that either. So that you would tend to have to go to maybe legal or the risk department within your company. You'll find a lot of the nature of your company, how much might be delayed revenue, how dependent you are on e-commerce or forward-facing services. You definitely would have to go to the CFO's office to find out information about the value of IP. That may be confidential. Again, that can often be a problem, getting some of this information. All of it is present within the company because all companies have capital allocations or capital budgets that have to be allocated every year. And there are competing projects for that limited resource. So the companies have already risked the projects that are brought to them, if you will, because they're saying, how much money is this likely to generate for us? And what is the risk that it won't generate as much as we think? Well, that's a risk analysis right there. So the information is there. It's a question of developing the relationships, I suppose, finding out which departments. The top ones I'd say would be legal, finance, and risk, and then go from there.
To one point off of that, and you hit on something I experienced, is certain information might be private or confidential internally, and difficult to get from, let's say, legal or HR, what have you. So using industry data, at least initially, to give some kind of range of what the losses might be, and presenting that to people and saying, hey, are we in the ballpark? Maybe you can't give me the exact dollar range. We're working in ranges anyway. Should I go a little wider on my ranges? It's a great starting point. You're not trying to say this IP is worth $1 million, right? You're giving it a range, but they won't often tell you, this intellectual property, if it's stolen, can cost us X. It's a struggle because you're thinking, hey, this is my company. I work here. Can't we all share? No. And we're not allowed to share. I mean, let's play in the same sandbox. So using industry data can really help. And back to what I said earlier about even aligning that with some of the attributes. If the attributes around an application, such as how critical is this application to the business, and if it went down, let's say you have a rough understanding of downtime and the cost, then you can associate that dollar amount with that field or attribute. And when the business answers something about their application that they can actually answer, you're pulling in industry data to at least associate and say, hey, this is where we're starting. I know I can't get exactly, even tighter, the distributions are more precise or more precision, but are we in the ballpark? It's a challenge I've tried to figure out how to navigate, because you still want to produce something of value. You can't just throw your hands up and say, well, they didn't give me that information, so I can't do it. You're trying to work with what you have, and you can generalize too and make assumptions, and then as long as you're calling out your assumptions, you're not hiding anything, you're trying to be as transparent as possible.
And I guess insurance companies ask these very particular questions. There's a lot of sensitive, confidential information that passes from clients to insurance companies. So being present in those underwriting meetings or understanding what the insurance manager or treasurer is collecting in order to get insurance might actually provide you with some of the answers, because they would have to have done that homework with those stakeholders internally to represent the risk. There's this concept of material misrepresentation that exists in insurance, where you do have to give an appropriate representation of the risk. And personal records is a good example. Some organizations had no idea that they had millions and not hundreds of records, and therefore the losses that the insurance company had to cover were very different. So that could constitute a material misrepresentation. And then there's another extent to which something can be fraudulent or criminal, so you're intentionally misrepresenting, and that's very different. But you were smiling, Erica, so I think you have
We're all going to call Monica to get information about our company instead of going internally.
Give us the inside track.
Yeah.
So, Monica, you mentioned things that are uninsurable. Can you give us some examples and maybe how you see something like FAIR-MAM over time helping resolve that?
FAIR-MAM.
FAIR-MAM.
FAIR-MAM. What did I say?
Cam.
Come on, Jack.
Sorry.
Get off that side of the mountain.
So intellectual property is one area that there is some insurance available, but I don't think it does what it should be, or I guess what organizations really want it to do. It's very hard to value intellectual property. There have been different products in insurance that have tried to get that insured, and there's been a lot of losses associated with it, so it hasn't been a cracked area. Uninsurability also comes from improvements, so anything that you better the organization after a loss. So improvements to software, to hardware. Insurance typically doesn't want to make you better. They want to make you whole. So those would be additional costs to you and typically uninsurable. They don't cover internal incident response costs because that is a business operational risk, and so they cover external incident response. And there's many other things like war and cyber warfare, and what that means from a threat actor perspective is considered uninsurable.
Yeah, boy, wouldn't that be a topic? Yeah, and probably will be. Probably has been.
It has been. Was it Pfizer one?
Yeah, lots of, I guess, not PETIA related claims that came out. But the way FAIR-MAM could help us look at insuring that loss is understanding how a client has come up with their exposure. So then you have something to price the insurance policy off of, and then you can look at the claims that are coming out of that assessment and see if you're as close as possible to what you priced the risk at. Without that, it's very hard.
Yeah, Monica, I'd just love to respond to that, or actually add to your question and comments. Let's assume I've done my analysis. I've done my FAIR-MAM analysis. I know what's insurable, I know what's not insurable, and I've calculated my fair average cyber loss exposure, right? And I know my risk appetite. And I know my loss exposure at the 95th and 99th percentile. How do I determine my insurance policy loss tolerance? I know it's a big question and there's a lot involved, but can you provide a little bit of guidance on that?
Well, I guess if you understand what your risk appetite is and what would make it efficient for you to transfer that risk, then you could determine that tolerance for insurance policy loss. It's
It's a premium cost versus your exposure sort of question, isn't it?
Plus deductible level, plus cash reserves.
Right.
Thank you for the help. I think crowdsourcing is the best.
Yeah.
So whatever your deductible is, you have to pay up until the deductible. So you need cash on hand for that, basically, cash reserve. And then anything that goes over should be covered by insurance as long as it is. So those are the variables that you need. That's the one of the variables that is the deductible level.
Up to my loss line, which is the policy.
We've lost control.
We've lost it.
Just go.
Come back to us.
Or maybe
Through capital reserve. Okay, I got that.
Okay.
I'm sorry about
All right,
that.
no.
So everything after the loss policy, I have to cover through my capital reserves. You know, whether after that insurance policy limit, which is the tolerance.
Yeah, it's actually, at first you have a deductible, so you still have your risk that you hold because nobody wants to take 100% of the risk. And then you have a finite amount of insurance and you still need additional capital for most of the uninsurable things. In most cases, organizations argue that there isn't enough insurance limit out there, so actually you never reach that sweet spot. It's unfortunate, but as the insurance market grows and capital investors are more comfortable with how we price risk and how we quantify risk, then we probably will be able to spread that risk more efficiently and get you to that maximum insurance limit that you're looking for.
We got our first question through the automated tool here from Paul. And so the question is, do the panelists know how do insurers take responses from cyber insurance applications and apply that in calculating potential losses?
There's a weighting mechanism. It's based on topics. Like I mentioned at the onset, even governance plays a weight in the premium that you get from an insurance policy perspective. But most of, I guess, the important pieces of information are actually about revenue, industry, employee count, personal data. Claims information is also something that now is featuring as a pricing tool. And then it's monitoring all the additional security controls that you disclose is to see what is actually driving some of the losses. So not all of the security controls that you provide to your insurance company make up the final premium or the amount of insurance limit that they can offer you. But in time, that will be part of it as well. If there's particular application questions that you're referring to, that would be an interesting thing to take away, Paul.
I was the one that asked that question. I fill out the application.
Okay.
So I'm hearing, I'm new to FAIR, but hearing what you guys are looking for from a loss magnitude perspective, I'm just trying to understand how that applies. It's really specific information. And the first categories you mentioned, yes, they're all part of the application. And you mentioned the key pieces, how many records, revenue, past 3 years, what you're projecting. So just curious.
We made FAIR-MAM at SAFE into an engine, and it has first party, third party, and insurance. So the engine stays the same, and we can absorb any custom exposure questionnaire into one of those three buckets and bring it into FAIR-MAM. So the more information, we find that most of the current policy questionnaires that we've seen have like this much on the loss magnitude side and this much on the control side. And most of it has to do with what's your revenue, what's your industry, what's your geography. And it's like, okay, what are your resources? You know, what's your business like? So we found we're working with the companies to begin to expand that to bring in, we came up with a 13-question minimum questionnaire. Not all the questions are applicable depending on the business resource mix, but that gives us enough that we can work with FAIR-MAM benchmarks and come up with a more predictable or useful initial starting point as loss magnitude for the insurance companies.
It's a broker's dream to know the loss magnitude, because then you can actually negotiate and structure your insurance policy limit in a more professional manner, aside from saying this control is not present, that should be present, which is not necessarily the insurance company's role to manage your businesses and make decisions on what security controls should be in place, but they are at that standoffish position where they're saying minimum standards are these.
Can you have that conversation in the other direction? You take that information to your insurer and say, you're kind of beating me up here on this amount because I have all this.
You mean the loss magnitude side?
Yeah. Taking that to the insurer and saying, you know, I don't know where you got your numbers, but based on what you got for our FAIR-MAM, give us a grade.
Yes, so that is definitely a way to use it. I think a lot of organizations are afraid that it will be used against them, as in once the insurers get smart about how the risk actually is quantified, and they'll be able to say, oh no, I don't want that risk. It's like, but that is the nature of the business. You actually want them to say no up front, not to say that they didn't know or you didn't disclose something. Or so it's much easier to get to the policy limits that you want because you have that negotiation power.
So we've got another question that came in from Josh. How do we manage the additional value versus additional effort for the detail of FAIR-MAM? For example, 6 forms of loss may be simpler and less precise, but how do we know if the added effort is worth the increased precision?
And then I'll defer to
Yeah.
you, but first I would say it's worth it because you have now reached defensibility. If you have a number, and that number has come out of your legal department, it's come out of your CFO's office, it actually reflects your company, your operations, your projections. And then you have some benchmark values that, let's say, your forensic costs, it's your contract, your retainer agreement you have with your external legal counsel, with your forensic investigators. You know, you've put all these numbers in, you've tuned them. This is what we actually pay our lawyers per hour. and you go on like that. So then someone says, we don't believe these numbers, the C-suite or the board. Then you say, which number do you want to change? And it's a wake-up call. That's why it's so critical to deal with your actual company's numbers. They're defensible. It may take, and the one thing about FAIR-MAM to point out, yes, it may take you a little while and a little effort to get these numbers. They don't change frequently. You should look at them maybe once a year, or if you have a major disposition or acquisition. But otherwise, they're going to stay pretty constant. So it's a big effort at first, but it's not like the security side where you have to keep following it and changing. I defer to you now.
Yeah, I agree. Take a step back, as I'm thinking about the question as far as like how much effort. And I wanted to put together a slide today, and I couldn't get to it. But as far as mapping, I did an exercise to map FAIR-MAM to the 6 forms of loss, and I kind of took Erica's model and exploded it out because, and she's already done the work, to be honest. Like, you know, there are primary, secondary losses, where they are response costs, et cetera. Not every.
His model was a beauty to behold.
She liked it. It was nice. She's my best PR. So what I found was in the process of getting my head wrapped around, again, I said I had to go through that translation of, I know 6 forms of loss, how much this model looks bigger, you know, Erica, what did you do? You made my life harder, but it made it, you know, made it more granular. And then I started realizing I don't have to use every one of these categories in FAIR-MAM for every situation. So what I wound up realizing is there aren't, for my needs or our needs, we didn't have to answer every particular form of loss in FAIR-MAM. They didn't all apply. So I still had similar effort to the 6 forms of loss, because when you look at 6 forms of loss, you're still saying, as I mentioned earlier, confidentiality. Well, maybe I'm going to have fines and judgments, but in an availability situation, I might not have fines and judgments. You still have to look at it contextually. So I also mapped effects to the FAIR-MAM model, and I started realizing for certain scenarios, when you build out, let's say, a decision tree, you start to see, well, confidentiality only has a couple of these columns, in the FAIR-MAM. I wish we had the FAIR-MAM model up. But not all of them apply all the time. And some of them just never applied for my particular situations. I don't know if it could be industry related or, but.
It's also attack outcome. And
yeah, so I think to answer the original question, the effort is more upfront, getting to understand it, how to organize the information, how to apply it to your particular situations. And then once you get your head around it, you start saying, all right, I kind of don't need this and this, but I need these. These are very important. And on top of that, from an 80-20 rule perspective, if you get most of the impacts, you're well on your way to being in a much better position to understand the impact side of the model, instead of saying, I have to have everything. I mean, over my career, I've just tried to take baby steps. Every time I didn't know something, I'm like, let me add a little bit more. Let me get a little bit better in these categories to my own, I don't know. I'm fighting myself because I want to be as granular and go down every rabbit hole I can. And get all of those, factors. So the amount of effort is similar once you get used to the FAIR-MAM model, I would say.
Another way to ask my question is, when do we dive all the way into that rabbit hole, and when is enough enough? So I think some good examples. It's not always going to apply. Not every part of FAIR-MAM is going to apply every.
Not every time.
No.
And some of it's just therapy for yourself. Like, stop. You really have to I don't know. I think most of us in this room, in the conference, we're pretty type A. We want to dive in. We want to be every penny. And then I don't know if you've ever done this, but even with the 6 forms of loss, if you try to get the best ranges possible, and you're going to take another 4 months to get more data, and you pull the range in slightly on the ends, or whatever the inputs are. I've messed around and said, what if I did that and I rerun it, and my output is not drastically different. So to your question, how much effort, is it worth it? You still have to have this quick turnaround time to provide value. Somebody's going to ask you a question, like, I bet you in 9 months. What value is that? So a lot of the front loading of the work, though, whether it's understanding the model or, as Erica mentioned, gathering this information, it doesn't change that often. You're just doing what most of us might have done already if you have a program, is building the program, right? So you take the whole FAIR-MAM, you say, all right, now let me just look at I don't know, for you guys it's this way, the right-hand side of the model, and say, I need to really focus on this and build out, what the impacts are as far as making it operationalized.
FAIR-MAM is basically, it's a financial model that can be either risked when it's proactive, with Monte Carlo simulation from the drivers up, or if it's reactive after an event, it's a strict financial model. You're actually saying, these are our projections on the low end of how long the business interruption will continue, and then once that part is finished and you know the costs, all 3 rows are min, max, and most likely are the same. And then your secondary losses should be Monte Carlo'd if there's still a likelihood, and then again, once you know they're either settled or not applicable, you max it out. But the actual model, when it was built, isn't the way it's, say, presented, sort of a tree or looking like the MITRE ATT&CK framework. It's actually a long column, and it literally is like a P&L statement, an income statement. And the drivers are a little more detailed than you see in an average income statement. But once you know the numbers, the inputs for those drivers at each of those rows, it's done. It's not a constant shot in the dark. And with any financial modeling, and FAIR-MAM, again, at the financial model level, is a sensitivity analysis tool. So you can see which drivers matter most. This doesn't have an effect, but if I change this, oh my goodness, there's a 20% change in loss. So you know this is what I need to focus on. But again, the hard work is in the beginning, but it's it's not something new. It's a P&L statement.
And it's probably worth more in the beginning to do it, to just endure the pain, because the investor is looking at your reporting when something does happen. That's even more painful to try to stand up the entire analysis as people are asking you, so what's this? How is it going to impact your results? Where are you going to go from here? Insurers are not your problem. It's the investor side, probably, that from a reputational perspective.
Exactly. And one last thing is the SEC, with its materiality requirements, has added the secondary loss capability, quantification as well. Not just what are your immediate primary costs, but how big could the secondary liability be? And in some areas, liability is becoming more complex and potentially larger. Like a test case is going to be Change Healthcare, United Health Group, because people are still feeling the fallout, the practitioners, from basically the clearinghouse went down. And they are going to file for claims, for losses, and it will be probably, the filings could easily be in the billions. How many get settled, I have no idea. But it's a changing landscape with all these supply chain attacks happening and taking down people's livelihoods.
So we are at time. It feels like we could spend another 45 minutes or an hour on this. There are a lot of questions, unfortunately, we weren't able to get to, but I think it's a fascinating topic. It's an area of real opportunity for us, for our profession to grow in and evolve in, and the contributions of these folks and others, I think, are going to be critical for getting us there. And sure appreciate your time and attention. If we could give these folks a round of applause, that would be wonderful.